Hello and welcome to the Methodist Podcast, this edition published on the 18th of June 2020. This week we preview the Methodist Conference, we hear about new guidelines to tackle sexual harassment, we consider the impact of the coronavirus on mental health, and we hear about the impact of the pandemic on bereavement.
We are people of a multitude of wise, troubling, hilarious, faithful human stories. So let's tell them.
The Reverend Dr. Barbara Glasson giving the presidential address in front of hundreds of people at last year's Methodist Conference held in Birmingham. Well, just 12 months later, and it feels like that was a lifetime ago, doesn't it? But the life of the church goes on, and the Methodist Conference 2020 begins next Thursday, though of course it's going to be somewhat different this year. The conference is the governing body of the Methodist Church and meets to discuss matters affecting the life of the church, the nation and the world. Ruth G. is the Assistant Secretary of the Methodist Conference, and I asked her how the conference was going to meet in this new world of social distancing.
Well, of course, because of the pandemic, we can't meet together. Normally, we would have been travelling to Telford next week, and over 300 of us would have been meeting in a hall in Telford, and we would have been able to worship together and split into groups and eat together and talk together. And we can't do those things. So this year, the conference is going to be online, and we've had to work out exactly how we can manage the conference with all its procedures.
The conference is going to be streamed live from Cliff College, but everybody still has to abide by social distancing, don't they?
Yes, a very small number of us will be in Cliff, the people that really have to be there in order to ensure that the conference functions properly. We will be socially distanced the whole time, including in the evenings and when we're eating. We will be in rooms in Cliff which will be prepared before we get there, and then nobody else will enter them the whole time that we're there.
And the representatives, they're still going to be voting and participating. How's that going to work?
We've got various ways of people voting, and people are getting very used to Zoom and blue hands being raised, and that's one way of doing it. You can also have poll cards on Zoom. And for some of the decisions we make, we need to have a ballot vote, a secret ballot vote, and that would be handled in a different way again. So we've got different ways of voting.
Some of the items that were going to be discussed this year are going to be held over, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. All our constitutional documents assume that we meet physically, and we don't have any constitutional basis for meeting in a conference anyway other than physically. So people might say, well, why are you meeting then? Why don't you just wait till next year? Well, the answer is that our documents also insist that we meet before the end of August. So what we have to do is really only the business that is essential and the business that can be properly done when we're not in the same space together. So the business that is essential, things like appointments and so on, we will do, but other business that involves a lot more discussion at depth, where people might hold different points of view and they need to balance those out together, where it's really quite important to be in the place to feel how the conversation's going. Those sort of conversations we can't do effectively and properly with this medium. And one example of that is the report God in Love Unites Us that was going to come to this conference that the Methodist Council has decided should now be deferred until next year. And we're very sad about that. But we felt that actually in order to do it properly, in order to give it the attention it deserves, we needed to defer it. The other thing with that is that there was a whole process of consultation in the districts, and some districts haven't been able to do that because they've not been able to meet.
And we can all watch the conference, can't we? What items should we look out for?
On the Saturday afternoon of the conference, the President and the Vice President for 2020 to 2021 will be inducted, and Richard and Carolyn will be at Cliff, and they will be in the studio that we have at Cliff, and the induction will happen. And then after they are inducted, each of them will give their inaugural address to the conference. That's always a special time, and it will be again, but it will look very different, because usually the former president hands across to the new president, puts it literally around the new president's neck. Well, we can't do that. So we've had to find different ways of making sure that that symbolism is there, but maintaining all the social distancing regulations. So that'll be one highlight, and really looking forward to the Saturday afternoon. And then on the Saturday evening, we have those people who are received into full connection. And that's a very Methodist thing. And it's when we actually say that people who are presbyters and deacons, who are ministers or who are going to be ministers, actually are received into a covenant relationship, a special relationship with the conference. And that has all sorts of meaning to it. And it's very, very important to us. And so that will happen on the Saturday evening. But normally, when they are received into full connection, and actually when the president and vice president are appointed, elected, normally the whole conference stands to vote and say, we affirm this. And that's a huge moment. You can imagine over 300 people standing up to say, we really affirm this. Well, you can't do that on Zoom. So again, we're having to make sure that we manage to make that special for them without being able to do it in the same way that we normally do. Another difference with it this year is that normally those who have not yet been ordained would go on that evening or afternoon to a service of ordination and be ordained. And we can't do that, because ordination really does mean that you have to be physically present in the same place. So their ordination won't happen until the time when we can manage to do that. The conference isn't only about business, it's also about worshipping together. And so we have regular worship. There will be worship in each session. The chaplains at conference are producing early morning prayers for people to join in with. So worship is very much a part of it, because we remember all the time that the reason we're there is because we're following our calling as disciples of Jesus in the world today.
The Methodist Church has released guidance around best practice to prevent and deal with sexual harassment, and to take responsibility away from the victims, and to ensure those who do harass are challenged and taken to task. Jill Baker is chair of the Methodist Council and has led on the guidance, and she joins me on the line now. Hello, Jill.
Hello, Mike. Thank you very much. Nice to join you from Glasgow.
Jill, these guidelines were sparked in part by the Me Too movement, weren't they?
I think it was certainly the Me Too movement that triggered it, yes, a couple of years ago now, as we remember when that first hit the headlines. And we realised that really the Methodist Church had never said anything publicly specifically about sexual harassment. We'd laid some good foundations with things like positive working together and the EDI toolkit, which both speak about how we treat one another. But neither of those refer specifically to sexual harassment. And there was an understanding, I think, that we needed to say a little bit more and help us all to think about our own behaviour.
And what's contained in the guidance? What does it ask people to do they're not doing already?
Yeah, of course, people are doing lots of things already. And I think perhaps one of the problems, and maybe one of the reasons why we needed the guidelines, is that we all tend to think that our own behaviour is fine. And we think that everybody else sees things in the way we do. And of course, that's not always the case. One of the comments that was made in a discussion about this at the Methodist Council was from a minister who realised that it wasn't just about how you intended your words or actions. It was about how your words or actions are perceived by somebody else. And so it's asking us really, I think, to look at how other people may perceive some of the ways that we do and say things. Just simple examples. I might meet somebody I know around Methodist Church House, a man, put out my hand to shake hands and find myself embraced in a hug, which I hadn't asked for and may not want. So it's about reading the signals and respecting that other people have different boundaries and different experiences and different cultural approaches, and that we need to recognise all of that. It centres around 5 R's, so that's perhaps something that we can remember. recognize initially. So we need to look out for our own behavior and perhaps observing behavior that's going on around us where other people don't feel empowered to speak out. So recognize the situation and then to respond. And there are various suggestions in the document about what's the appropriate way to respond in different situations. And to refer, very often cases might need to be referred to somebody else. To record, as it with all safeguarding, so that we can learn from what we're doing and take note of what we're doing. And finally, to reflect and see in what ways our behaviours or our setup can be changed to eliminate it. So recognise, respond, refer, record, reflect are the 5.
And I presume this is a document that you'd encourage everybody to read and certainly not to wait until there's a problem.
Yes, absolutely. I would say it's really been designed for everybody. It's not part of the code of conduct for ministers. It's something for everybody within our churches and using our churches. And I would say, yes, read it. Read it as soon as you can get your hands on it. It will be available on the Methodist Church website immediately, and there'll be printed copies a little bit later on when we know how the lockdown situation is going to work out. But Place for Hope, a reconciliation organisation based in Scotland, have put it together in a very attractive and eye-catching way that helps us, I think, to reflect on this. This is part of our spiritual response to life. This is part of our Christian discipleship, how we understand God creating everybody in God's own image and how we treat one another with that respect.
With everything that's going on in the world, you probably won't be surprised to hear that many people are struggling with their mental health. Paul Morrison is a policy advisor working with the Methodist Church as part of the joint public issues team, and he's been looking into some of the research about how people are coping emotionally with the lockdown and with the coronavirus. Paul, what's the research telling us?
Well, we've known for a while that when you talk to ministers or community leaders, that there's a concern that the lockdown might have caused problems with people's mental health. And often the story you hear is about someone who's isolated and having to look after or homeschool their children. So we've known that this is a risk for some time. But earlier this week, a well-known and respected think tank called the Institute of Fiscal Studies published data which was of a huge survey of the British population looking at mental health. And the numbers in it were really, really striking, that the number of people who were saying that they experienced some form of mental health problem, and it's quite a serious trigger for that, had more than doubled over what was expected at this time of year. So we can say fairly conclusively that what people are seeing and what the worries that ministers have been telling us sort of bears out in high quality data.
Although everybody has been affected by the coronavirus, not everybody's been affected in the same way or to the same degree, have they?
I think the analogy I'd use is that COVID is a storm which we're all in. But some people are in quite secure and large boats, so they're being buffeted. It's not an easy time, but actually they feel safe and secure. They know they're going to get through it. But there are some people for whom they're on small and leaky boats, and they are frightened that they will get their way through all of this. And again, it's about whether you've got caring responsibilities, whether or not you've suffered a big loss of income, and actually whether or not you're young. And one of the big messages, and I think, which I think we need to hear, is that older age groups, of which I'm pushing up there myself, we may feel that we're having a very difficult time, but we should really look around ourselves to wonder whether or not others are having a much worse time. Now, that might not be true for each individual, but it's worth checking. It's worth trying to understand whether your neighbour who's 25, who's just out of university, who's maybe not got a secure job, whether or not they're the ones having the really tough time at this point in time.
These are clearly unusual times which would have been incredibly difficult for government to prepare for in some ways. But with uncertainty over schools and uncertainty over employment, what's the role for the government in helping us achieve better mental health during this crisis?
This isn't something that can be fixed today. There is no great program the government can roll out that will stop this. And actually, the government increased universal credit and introduced the job retention scheme, which supported people's incomes. And there's quite a strong correlation between being frightened for your income and having and not having good mental health. But moving forward, the question is whether or not government seeks to provide people security and security about the future. Does universal credit provide a bedrock that you know that if everything else goes wrong, I'll be all right, I'll be able to pay my rent and feed my children? If government provides that security and provides that framework for security, then that will really help with mental health. There's obviously all sorts of issues about treatment, but it would be much better if we supported people and allowed them to feel secure so that less people go towards treatment.
What can the church do to support people through this?
When you measure people's mental health, you ask them questions about how they feel about themselves. And looking at a huge uptick in young people saying, I don't have self-confidence, I feel depressed, I don't have hope for future, I don't have self-worth. That breaks your heart. And the role of the church for millennia has been to say that you are loved and created in the image of God. You are cared about no matter what. And going forward, we're going to have to find really new and innovative ways of telling people that they are loved, that there is hope, and that they are made in the image of God. And that's a great challenge to us. And it's a great role that we've been given.
At Swanbank Methodist Church in Stoke-on-Trent, a wall of remembrance has been created for people to add the names of their loved ones who've died during the coronavirus pandemic. Reverend Katherine Stevens says that she was moved to install the wall after she supported many families through funerals under lockdown.
I think having reflected on some of the funerals that I've taken during this time of COVID, I felt really what we were able to offer grieving families felt quite inadequate because of the constraints around numbers at funerals, around not being able to engage with families in the same way we might want to pastorally. And I remember taking my first funeral service during lockdown and coming away feeling that it had been really quite inadequate, quite stark, not being able to offer comfort like we might usually want to. And so I started to think about how we could respond as a church to our community. A friend of mine, Tracy Hume, set up, she's a deacon up in the northeast, and she put together some bags of remembrance, and in them was a crocheted forget-me-not. And so I started to think about that. What could we do with that? How could we maybe use that idea within Burslem, the town that I serve? So we've got a little box that's attached to the wall, and in the box has our forget-me-not flowers and has some marker pens as well. And so, and the part of the artwork is an explanation of how to engage with the wall. So people can simply take a pen out and write the name of their loved ones.
I imagine a lot of people are missing something of the closure that a funeral with family and friends can provide. Are there any plans to hold memorial services for those people who've died when the time is right?
Yes, so one of the little message from the church that's on the forget-me-not says if you want any additional support, please contact us. It also says that when we are able, we will be joining together and offering a memorial service for any who are grieving, who would like to remember their loved ones. As well as that, we have offered to hold memorial services for individuals as well. So we had one couple who came to write 2 names on the wall, and they lost a parent, and then about a month later, last month, they lost their son, who was just in his 30s, who died of cancer. and they were saying how in normal time they would have had a crematorium absolutely filled with his friends, and there were 10 people at that service. And so they were talking about how they've felt they haven't been able to hold the service that they would have wanted for their son, and how his friends haven't been able to grieve in the way that they would usually have been able to share in that service. So while it's the first time I've met that family, I was able to say to them, look, if you need to use Swanbank Church, if I can be of help in any way, then please get in touch. Really happy to be able to offer you a home for that service, and to help in any way that we can. So it's very much a gentle way of getting alongside grieving families who haven't been able to grieve in the way that is traditional for us.
Last weekend, celebrations took place online to mark the 120th birthday of Parchmore Methodist Church in Thornton Heath near Croydon. Back in the late 1960s, Parchmore was at the vanguard of the Methodist movement to embrace community engagement, inspired in part by its then minister, George Lovell, as the current minister, the Reverend Nadine Wilkinson, explains.
Well, Parchmore is now a church in South London, but in the book, The Parchmore Partnership, Reverend Peter Sharrocks describes how Thornton Heath began as a village at the end of a railway line. Parchmore Church is within 3 minutes walk of the railway station and was built when Thornton Heath was a desirable village in 1900s. It's described as a typical Wesley preaching house with a large central pulpit, a choir, an organ behind it, and a gallery. And then, in the words of the Reverend Dr. George Lovell, those of us who were at Parchmore in 1967-68 changed what was conceived of as a building project for youth work into a church, youth and community development project. Now, before George came to Parchmore, he was minister in the congregation in which Leslie Griffiths was nurtured and came into faith. And in 2018, Parchmore celebrated 50 years of community partnerships. And all those partnerships have explored what we describe as the Parchmore way, the interrelated development of community and church.
One of those to send their greetings via the internet was the Methodist peer, Lord Leslie Griffiths, who knew George Lovell and reflected upon his impact and that of the Parchmore way.
Well, George Lovell died a couple of years ago, and his son, just shortly afterwards, wrote to me and said, he's clearing out his dad's affairs, and he's found a whole box file, I have it here, a whole box file full of letters from me to him when I was 18, 19, 20 years of age. And one of them, which I've just picked out now, is from 228 Green Lane, London, SW16, which was the manse for the Parchmore Church in 1972, the 10th of May. And in it, George is writing to me in Haiti, and we are discussing community development. Of course, he had learned that at Parchmore. Parchmore taught him the intricacies of community development. And I'm learning from George in my turn what it means with a group of people to discover and unearth the gifts that we all have and to put them at the disposal of the community we are a part of. Parchmore has this feeding center and these social services. I've become aware of some of them, and I take my hat off to you for preserving the spirit of Parchmore in this way. We must keep alert, keep awake, and remember that love is the fulfilling of the law. So, the community development message of George Lovell, the community development of the work of Parchmore, a beacon in a benighted land, fills me with encouragement and hope. And my prayer is that at this anniversary time, you continue to hold fast to that which has been imparted to you. Hold fast and go forward with that message.
This week's prayer is shared with us by Joanna Tetty, a mission partner working with the Methodist Church in Togo, West Africa.
As we go through the storm, not knowing when it will end, some are in awe of God's power, whilst others cower in fear. Some marvel at God's provision of the oil that never finishes, whilst others worry. Some bask in the paradise of another day with family, whilst others have days filled with fear, loneliness, and depression. Lord Jesus, whatever our situation, help us to remember your constant promises, that you are in control and that you will never leave us nor forsake us. Whatever the situation, help us, Lord, to count our blessings as we wait on you. Help us to remember your promises, believe in the sun will shine again. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this week's Methodist podcast, and do let us know if you or your church have something you'd like us to feature. From myself, Mike Ivat, goodbye.